Hello, good afternoon or good morning to all the guests, depending on wherever you are joining us today. My name is Adishri Jamkhetkar. I'm the Program Manager for the German Center for Research and Innovation, New Delhi, and it is my absolute pleasure to welcome all of you to this panel discussion and networking event on Indo-German Dialogue on Science Diplomacy for International Cooperation today. Now, before we move ahead, a little bit of introduction on the DWIH and how do we fit into the context of science diplomacy. So the DWIH, or the German Centers for Research and Innovation, DWIH, which is the name for its German long name, are a network of German research organizations, universities, funding bodies, research-based companies, and 5 sub-centers exist across the world. The DWIHs are an initiative of Germany's Federal Foreign Office and are managed by the German Academic Exchange Service, known as DAED to most of you. These serve as an important instrument in Germany's science diplomacy policy, and they also find a mention in the latest strategy paper of the Foreign Office, and also in the Asia, and also the policy guidelines for the Asia Pacific region. So you can take a look at that. In India, the DWIH New Delhi promotes the German research landscape, but also acts as a gateway for India and Germany to access each other's research and innovation ecosystems. It offers a platform for enhancing exchange cooperation and networking among academic communities as well as stakeholders in research, science, and innovation. And its activities focus on current topical issues, not only in science and humanities, covering a broader range, but also we cover fundamental as well as applied research. So with that introduction, I would like to now come to the next part of our event, and I would like to welcome our guest and colleague at the German Embassy in New Delhi, Mr. Philipp von Ritter, who is the Science Counselor and Head of the Science and Technology section at the Embassy, and he is here to have his opening remarks. Mr. Philipp von Ritter, over to you. Thanks a lot for joining us.
I would say I'm especially delighted to be here today as a science counselor because science diplomacy is part of my job description. It's part of the job description of my 3 team members team colleagues at the science section at the embassy, and it's, by the way, also part of the job description of my ambassador, who regularly meets with students, researchers, and science administrators. Science diplomacy is also part of the job of the many German science agency colleagues who are present here in India, assembled, as you mentioned, Alishi, under the roof, so to say, of the DWIH, which should host today's discussion. Science diplomacy is also part of the job and done by our Indian counterparts in ministries, in institutes like the RIS, in research institutes and in universities. And it's also done, of course, by diplomats and scientists from other countries. And I know that today many EU science counselors are also joining this discussion. So that's a lot of people doing science diplomacy. But I think it's many here in Delhi for a good reason, because this number corresponds with the intensity of cooperation between India and Germany, 2 partners that are made for each other, as Prime Minister Modi put it. And I think this high number of science diplomats, so to say, corresponds with the important place that science and technology has in our cooperation. We have over 25,000 Indian students in Germany, of whom around 2,000 are pursuing a PhD. We have numerous joint Indo-German research cohorts in a huge variety of disciplines. We have a joint Indo-German Institute for Industrial Research Cooperation, the IGSCC. And we have India and Germany who are partners in international mega science projects like the DESI and the FAIR particle accelerators. So we have really a widespread cooperation, and therefore it should not come as a surprise that science and technology is at the heart of bilateral diplomacy. And when Chancellor Merkel visited Delhi in 2019, research cooperation, in that case on artificial intelligence, was at the very top of the agenda of discussions with Prime Minister Modi. And when the two spoke only 2 weeks ago, again, they agreed that research cooperation should be strengthened between our two countries. So, we may even see intergovernmental consultations soon, and I think it's a safe bet if I say that research and innovation would again figure prominently on the agenda. So I think it's quite clear. Discussing science diplomacy between Indian and Germany ministry representatives and researchers and the experts is a highly relevant and a highly promising endeavor. I myself experienced that in December when I was part of a panel discussion hosted by the German Foreign Ministry, in which an MP and heads of German science agencies discussed ways forward for German science diplomacy. And all the panelists showed a huge interest for the practice of science diplomacy here in Delhi. And I think here in Delhi, with the Indo-German partnership that goes so strong, we really have perfect conditions to explore ways and to think about science diplomacy for the mutual interests of our science communities, for the mutual interest of our diplomatic communities, and for the mutual interests of our democracies. And I look very much forward to a discussion and hand over back to you, Anish.
Thank you so much, Philip, for your input. Now we move on to the main part of the event. Dr. Katja Lasch will take over from here. But before that, here's a short introduction on her. Dr. Katja Lasch is the director of the DWIH New Delhi and the DRAD regional office in New Delhi since October 2019 and is responsible for its strategic management. Prior to this, she has headed the DRAD's international research marketing division at the headquarters in Bonn and also the DAD Information Center in Bucharest, Romania. Her professional focus and interests lie in the fields of international university and research cooperation, as well as entrepreneurship. She has been involved in the science diplomacy initiatives of the German Federal Ministry of Education and Research and has served as a jury on their prize for education and science diplomacy. She holds a doctorate in history and is also qualified in business administration. Dr. Katja Lasch, over to you. Have a successful session.
Thank you, Philip, for the introduction, and welcome to our audience. I've seen we have multiple stakeholders of science diplomacy in the audience. So science diplomacy is manifold, as we can see. We have attendees coming from foundations who are financing science. We have the DST in the audience. But we also have representatives of German universities, and I've been also seeing representatives of consulates and science counselors in the audience. So welcome to all of you. It's my pleasure to host this panel, which is the first event of the DWIH this year. It's a closed event, it's a stakeholder event, and we wanted to focus on science diplomacy. International research and science cooperation are mainly driven by researchers who focus on discovery. I think that's known to everybody. But we have seen over the last year that with increasing globalization, the science diplomacy has becoming a more virulent topic. Of course, the term of science diplomacy is old. It's used already in the 18th, 19th century, and we had seen in the Cold War in the 50s, 60s, manifold institutions who have been active in the field. But one could say that over the last 10 years, I would say there has been a amplification of usage of the definition of science diplomacy. So the last decade has seen an integrated need for the integration of science cooperation and also international relations. So science diplomacy, who is placed between international research cooperation and international relations. And I think that's also a result that we have seen over the last 20, 25 years, an increasing globalization, and also that we have now a multipolar scientific world. So it's not longer the US and Europe who are dominating science and technology. We have upcoming new powers in science as India, Brazil, but also to name Russia and China, of course. There is no concrete definition of science diplomacy, but maybe one could say that the term is widely used to describe a set of activities at the intersection of science, technology, and foreign policy, and that makes it different than from international cooperation. And I think that the concept of the Royal Society and the AAAS presented in 2010 is still alive, and I think we will relate today in this discussion to the 3 dimensions of science diplomacy. So science in diplomacy, which means informing foreign policy objectives with scientific advice. That's something we will address in the discussion. Diplomacy for science, which means facilitating international science cooperation. And last but not least, science for diplomacy, using science cooperation to improve international relations between countries. So you see there's a couple of perspectives of science diplomacy. So as I mentioned, a lot of stakeholders are involved, and I'm lucky that we have a prestigious panel today with us. We will focus our discussion on the policy level, and I would like to welcome to our panel Stefan Delfs, who is connected from Berlin. He is a trained lawyer and holds a master in American law from the Tulane University in New Orleans, and he is serving as a diplomat of the German Foreign Office. He has served inter alia in Minsk, New York, and Ankara, and he also was advisor to the President of the UN General Assembly. Currently, he's heading the Division for Higher Education, Science and Research in the Foreign Office, and this division is also funding the German Centers for Research and Innovation. Mr. Delfs, welcome to our discussion. Our second panelist is Sachin Chaturvedi, who is currently the Director General at the Research and Information System for Developing Countries, RISE. He works on issues related to development economics, involving development finance, SDGs, and South-South cooperation. He has been part of several important initiatives of the government of India and takes keen interest in transforming economic policy making towards integrated and evidence-based approaches. And you see here we have the evidence-based approaches again. He was, amongst others, fellow at the Macmillan Center for International Affairs at the Yale University and visiting scholars at the German Development Institute, brings also in a German perspective. And he is also heading the Indian Forum for Science Policy, and we will learn a bit later what is the Indian Forum. Last but not least, Maria Josten, who's connected from Bonn to us. She has been working for the German Aerospace Center and the Project Management Agency, DLR, in the field of European and international cooperation in Bonn, Germany since 2005. On behalf of the Federal Ministry for Education and Research, BMWF, she has been responsible for science and technology cooperation with Russia for 8 years. And since 2018, she has been working for the section Strategy and Monitoring. Her division supports the BMBF in implementing the federal government's internationalization strategy and also the activities in science diplomacy. Her main responsibility is in the observation and analysis, conceptualization and implementation of science diplomacy activities. So she has been behind a lot of papers, and she has also been currently involved in a European project on science diplomacy. So Ms. Josten, welcome again to the panel. So as mentioned by Adishri Chamketkar, we will have a bit later the possibility to have ask also live questions. If you have questions, comments, please free to put them also in the chat. I will also try to put them already up in the first part of the discussion. So my first question goes to Mr. Delfs. The German government has published last year, I think it was the second half of the year, a new strategy paper on science diplomacy. My question would be in 2 ways or in 2 directions. Why did the government fail to place a new strategy? And what is the new in the approach of the new science diplomacy strategy of the German government?
Excellent, thank you. Yeah, thanks for having me on this prestigious panel. We have decided to launch this strategy because we wanted to be clearer for ourselves, and we thought that in this very time of change, we had to position ourselves and to make clear what our direction would be. As you said, science diplomacy has a long, long history reaching back centuries and centuries. And we thought for the next years, we need a framework what we want to achieve. Philip von Ritter has already mentioned all the different actors in India and the closeness of the relationship in science and research between our 2 countries. But as a larger framework, we thought it is important now to strengthen the role of diplomacy and science, both of them, and to see where we can better connect, where we can support each other, because that's mutual. As you said, science for diplomacy and the other way round. Especially in these times of the pandemic, it becomes more and more clear that evidence-based policymaking is vital for our democratic societies. That's another aspect. We wanted to strengthen with our actions that follow from the strategy academic freedom worldwide. We see numerous examples where this freedom is threatened. I just mentioned the recent events in Belarus, and we have difficult partners like Russia, China, and some others. And there we want to make clear what it's about to defend academic freedom, and as well to save researchers and students, to bring them into a safe harbor. Another important aspect is, of course, multilateralism. That's on our agenda, not only in New York and Geneva, but also in other contexts. And these are important for scientists, but as well for us as Germany, to see that we have common solutions to achieve the SDGs, and we only have 10 years left for that. Perhaps I can pick up one other element which is important. We want to strengthen the attractiveness of Germany as a place for study and research. The figures mentioned by Philip are very impressive. We welcome students from all over the world, and we try to get even more despite the pandemic. And also we invest a lot in our research so that we can offer possibilities. Just to mention one prominent example, the Nobel Prize for chemistry went to a French researcher who is working in Berlin, and that's a wonderful example how cooperation beyond natural borders can work and bring fruit. Perhaps I leave it here and go back to you.
Thank you so much for this interesting insight. Yeah, one would not expect necessarily to have freedom of science, citizen science, and science communication in the science diplomacy strategy. I found it very interesting when reading the paper. But maybe Mr. Chaturvedi and Mr. Devs mentioned multilateralism, and India adhered to the Alliance for Multilateralism. So maybe two short questions on India, as you're heading the Indian Forum for Science Diplomacy. And I know you have been actively involved in the design of the new science and technology and innovation policy, which is currently in public discussion in India. So where is the science diplomacy of India standing, and what are the future plans? Maybe you can also relate to multilateralism. As in the new diplomacy, one can read in paragraph 9, India stands for a proactive science diplomacy. So what is that standing for?
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Dr. Katya. And of course, thanks to DWIH for giving this opportunity and engaging with us on this very important theme. As far as the new STIP policy is concerned, and your question about multilateral engagement that India is trying to promote through our new STIP policy, there are twin objectives that are extremely clear in terms of how we are going forward. And if I just take a step back up, you would see India as one of the few countries which are not only providing the development partnership, engaged with development partnership, but are also themselves receiving ODA, and Germany is one of the biggest partners apart from Japan. So India's quantum of partnership that we are engaging with other developing countries, be that in Africa or in our own neighborhood in Southeast Asia, particularly Vietnam, Myanmar, I would say Laos, Cambodia, the CLMV countries, it has multiplied over the years, and contribution to the multilateral initiatives, be that in form of the International Solar Alliance or the CDRI, that has gone up multiple times. And the current policy framework that has come out is precisely reflecting this dimension of engaging with the agencies and institutions and trying to bring in coherence. So what we heard from Dr. Philip Reiter is absolutely right, that Prime Minister Modi's emphasis in terms of bringing a whole of government approach to science and technology is absolutely clear, be that through the setting up of a new division in the Ministry of External Affairs, what is being called as NEST, New Emerging and Strategic Technologies Division in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the role that a principal scientific advisor is playing. It also became quite evident throughout the process of handling of the COVID-19 pandemic and the cooperation that we extended to partners and neighboring countries, and also the multilateral institutions. The role that we are trying to see at the global level, Dr. Kailash, is actually at these twin levels. One, in terms of what is that we can achieve through bilateral engagements and what we can provide through bilateral engagement. The second is more in terms of multilateral engagement, be that for promotion of science, technology, and innovation for SDGs. And after the Japan's G20 presidency, we could launch and be part of global project on SDI for SDGs. In fact, the PSA himself is leading this along with the RIS, which has been mandated to take this project forward. We have EU, Japan, and 5 countries from Africa. So we are working with ECOS to take STI for SDG forward. So that is part of the UN SDG engagement program, and also trying to see how the mega projects can. So if you see in the policy statement, there are these tools of new engagement, providing fellowships to students. And as Dr. Philip Reiter mentioned, there are 25,000 students from India there and 5,000 of the PhD. And we are having here more than 100,000 students from Africa alone who are under various fellowship programs. So this kind of crisscross that we are seeing is something which is giving a very unique role to India, and under the current government's very proactive role, I would say, the startups, the cutting edge technology research, and also trying to see how the solutions for agriculture and health, particularly the two sectors which are, as you might have noticed from the STIP policy document, are under huge emphasis by the government. So that's the larger track we are following.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for this first insight. Ms. Josten, if one looks at the website of the German Ministry for Education and Research, and one looks up science diplomacy, one meets 3 terms: inform, connect, and enable are the 3 keywords which are standing behind the strategy of the ministry. What is behind these terms, and how does the Ministry of Research and Education see science diplomacy and its contribution to science diplomacy?
Thank you very much for this question. First of all, I would like to thank you for inviting me to this important and also very interesting panel discussion on science diplomacy. The Federal Ministry for Education and Research aims with the science diplomacy, within the science diplomacy, to solve global challenges, to improve mutual learning, and also to ensure prosperity and economic growth. And as you have already said, there are three main pillars, and these three main pillars are related to the definition of the Royal Society: Science in Diplomacy, Science for Diplomacy, and Diplomacy for Science. The first pillar is dedicated on creating lasting partnerships based on trust with a country or with a region. This kind of activities help to secure international stability. This is the term connect. The second pillar is to help to solve global, regional, and national challenges. And innovation plays a very important role in this field, because we need innovation and transfer from science to technology to ensure also social benefits and further development in different countries. And this is the pillar inform. As already mentioned, we need evidence-based policy making. So this is also a very important topic for the Federal Ministry for Education and Research. And the third pillar is to create framework conditions, infrastructures to enable indeed scientists to work together, and this is what we are aiming with activities, with funding instruments in the Federal Ministry of Education and Research. And I believe we have many examples of how these three pillars could be involved or have been involved in recently. In the last 5 years, the Federal Ministry for Education and Research funded 2,600 R&D projects in the field of science diplomacy, and more than 130 Indo-German projects are listed there. The aim of the ministry is, of course, to show these efforts, and also we are preparing on behalf of the Federal Ministry for Education and Research an interactive map, which will be posted at the website you mentioned in the next few months, hopefully. And I think these are some few examples how science diplomacy in these three fields could be implemented. So I would like to stop here, and probably we will have the opportunity to discuss some details on the three pillars later on. Thank you.
Yes, and the example of the three pillars you find on the website, which we just posted in the chat, so if people would be interested. We're discussing the policy level. A lot of energy goes into formulating policy strategies. Now, there's huge processes behind implementations and so on. But one could ask certainly the question, Mr. Chaturvedi, does international cooperation really need science diplomacy? So does international research really need the support of foreign policy, and what's the benefit of it?
I fully agree with this question, and I think it brings in the point that Stefan made in the beginning. We require such a narrative on the development that we want the world to have, and there we need emphasis on the kind of frameworks we are setting ourselves through global negotiations, be that in the realm of biodiversity, conservation, plurality, and also in terms of what kind of bioethics we want to follow. And that's where the governance, global governance of science, technology, and innovation comes in. It happens through various multilateral processes. It may be in form of the access, equity, and inclusion, AEI, part of which we address through SDGs, part of which we address through several global conventions, through agencies like UNESCO, and also through entities like UNIDO and a couple of others. So they are the ones who are actually contributing in terms of conservation of biodiversity in the oceans. So what kind of ocean management we require, what kind of blue economy is right, and when it enters in the red zone. So how the trawlers and industrial exploitation of fisheries and other sectors, you require countries to have self-restraint in terms of how much they can contribute and in what manner they can contribute. This requires the depth and the bandwidth to manage goals and also the global commons. And this is where the role of diplomacy comes in. What we are doing for Arctic Circle is equally important for Himalayan region. So how the diplomats can really collate their energy, the power to respond to that, and how the economic forces and commercial forces can be sort of converged with these larger global goals of sustainability. And that's where I see the role of science diplomacy. There are certain countries, and some of those have already been named by Stefan in the beginning. I don't want to repeat that, but I think the governance is required. And you yourself in the beginning, Dr. Katya mentioned about the Biden administration and new hope and expectation from the world's largest economy to be more responsible and more concerned about Paris commitments of ours for Addis Ababa Action Agenda. I think these dimensions require diplomacy to play far more active role and far more constructive engagement with the global governance process. So science, technology, and development are intrinsically linked, and with that is the idea of global governance. The rush for resources, the rush for nature of technology that we want, and more governance in genomics. They require not artificial babies, they require greater following of bioethics and self-control. After a lot of global criticism, if you put scientists behind bars, that's not something we want. We want preemptive measures to come in and do not encourage mindless rush for edge in technology. And that, I think, is important. It is equally important that we protect the global commons, be that in form of SWIFT, which is for monetary and fiscal access of the banks, for money transfer, for fintech solutions. We want ethic-based science policy to come up, and that's where role of diplomacy comes in. It works through various global arrangements, and it is important that we engage those UN institutions in managing and bringing in governance that is needed.
Yeah, thank you so much. So we learned that diplomacy is important in science. So maybe to take it to a more concrete level, Mr. Devs, how one can, on a ministerial level, like your level, foster science diplomacy, and maybe you can name some instruments which you have in place in that field, so that we get a better holding on the definition and on the theories we are talking here about.
Well, maybe I start with the most known programs, and these are the exchange of students and researchers. You all know the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation, that is an equivalent to excellence in science, and they work to exchange persons, basically. And the DLD is there to enable the mobility of students worldwide coming in and going out from Germany, and as well fostering cooperation between universities. So this is very traditional, but it's important, and it's of course well funded over the last years. The budget has risen substantially. But to name a few new initiatives, let me mention an institute in Colombia that is working to accompany the peace process there. So the researchers study the process, but at the same time they give their input, their lessons from other conflicts, to bring this very difficult process to a successful end. And this is, of course, an exercise for years and years to come, but it's a close cooperation between Colombian universities and German universities and others. It's not limited to the two countries. So that's a very concrete example, and we will try to recreate such type of institute in other conflict areas. Maybe I can mention a project that happened recently in the US, where we had a transatlantic common cultural year. And there on the Mississippi, we had a number of events going back to the notion of the Anthropocene, so that we as humankind can shape the globe. And in the example of this river, we wanted to showcase what the influence of mankind is on the lives of the persons living there, and of course as well the challenges there are, including deforestation, the soil issues we have, and the difficult situation with the floodings in the Mississippi Delta. These are two small examples. I could name a number of other ones maybe later in the discussion. What is important for strategy, of course, that it is put into action, and in the strategy we have named a few points, but we are working on other programs at the moment. Let me mention a third one, that is to protect students in different areas of the world if they are in danger, if they have been thrown out from their own universities, and we are now shaping a program to bring them to Germany so that they can finish their studies here.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. So, program for students, for researchers we already have in place with the Philipp Schwarz Initiative. Yeah, Ms. Osten, I found it extremely interesting, and maybe that's a nice input how one can take a different approach on fostering and enabling science diplomacy. The BMBF has running a competition and will award a prize for education in science diplomacy. Why did you choose that format, and what is the expected outcome of it?
It was quite interesting to see what is the main topic actually in this competition. When we are talking about science diplomacy, it's necessary to underline that communication is important. And we have already mentioned in the discussion previously that it is important also to talk about communication of scientific outcome in the community and also to policymakers. And this is actually the aim of this kind of award on science diplomacy. The idea behind is that BMBF supports projects related to different kind of research and technology innovation actions. And the aim of this award was to promote established S&T cooperation, which have ensured long-standing partnerships with politically challenging regions or countries, which have opened new communication ways between science, society, and policy, and also which outcome has been used as a base for evidence-based policy. Why competition? Because we wanted to collect different examples to compare them and to have, of course, a high-ranked jury. You were participating in that activity to select the best projects and to showcase how important science diplomacy is in the field of communication. The applicants have applied with three kinds of materials. They have provided videos promoting international cooperation, a description of the outcome of previous initiatives, and also a concept for making and promoting their activities. And I believe that the three winners are have provided very interesting outcome and also suggestions how to communicate science diplomacy in the future. They will be announced officially in an event prepared and organized by the Federal Ministry of Education and Research in April 2021. And I would like also to underline that the participation of the society was very important for the ministry, and that is the reason why these three winners have been presented at the website of the ministry. In the society, the public have had the chance to vote and to decide who will win the public prize. And I think the announcement will be also made in April 2021. So stay tuned. Thank you very much.
I think a very important aspect, citizen science and the involvement of citizens in the whole discourse, also reflected in the strategy put in place. Before we take it maybe to the Indo-German cooperations, I would address a bit the question of science diplomacy and international cooperation in time of raising nationalism. Science diplomacy is advocating for international science cooperation and also key to improve international relations. But we have witnessed, and we of course have to tackle the pandemic in this discussion, we have witnessed in the pandemic that international cooperation is really important if one looks at the vaccine development. But we also have discussions going on self-reliance, global value chains, and the necessity of the states to be more independent from global value chains and to do their own science. So if one looks at papers, at the discussion ongoing, I think the race for vaccines is a very, very good example. So on the one side, the wonderful cooperation, and I think AstraZeneca, the vaccine used in India, is a good example. But on the other hand, the discussion, shouldn't we keep the vaccines in the country? Should we really distribute it to other countries? So also discussions going on in the media. So Mr. Chaturvedi, if one looks at the new SDIP, and not just on the new SDIP, there's a strong focus on indigenization and fostering self-reliance. And I would like to know how this relates to international cooperation, if the goal is to be indigenous and to foster or to be self-reliant.
No, very good question, Dr. Katalesh. And I think if you look at the emphasis on Indianization or endogenous development, there is adequate emphasis on equal partnership. There is equal emphasis on global narrative setting, and there is equal emphasis on value positive partnership. So wherever it is necessary, India should play an active role in terms of enhancing India's own contribution, be that in form of financial resources or in form of knowledge partnership and through the scientific manpower. India should be working along with all the countries that are coming up with larger projects. And it is not now. If you see, when the CERN was initiated, India was very much part of the process, and India contributed in the projects like CERN. So there are issues in terms of how we can be part of the global processes, be there as part of the responsibilities that are needed in terms of the wider, as I said earlier, international governance of science, technology, innovation processes, but also see that India also grows economically. At this stage, till India announced what is now being called as Atmanirbhar Bharat or Self-Reliant India, Prime Minister's emphasis is very clear in terms of how we reduce our import dependence. For a country of this size that India is, our dependence on imports was many fold much more than what is desirable. And in fact, had this not been the case, the pandemic has really opened up eyes of policymakers because of crucial dependence on China and the politics that China played with access to medicine. Particularly, all the APIs were stopped, and then India PPE that we were not producing, and in last 10 months, the size of the industry has multiplied from almost negligible sector to 7,500 crores. That's the kind of quantum we could produce. Ventilators that were few and largely imported. Now we are exporting ventilators, and this all has happened in 10 months. And thanks to China that they took this stiff position vis-a-vis other geostrategic factors that influence the decision. So I think it was important for India to get into the idea of self-reliance and develop sectors where crucial supplies are needed. Vaccines, India was always a major supplier at the global level, and now with research and innovation, we could excel and are now supplying to all our neighbors. So this, I think, is a very important moment in the history of India's engagement with fellow developing countries, but also with developed countries. India is playing an extremely constructive role with WHO in terms of how the larger global initiative on vaccines be strengthened. India has contributed resources with Brazil, with South Africa under the IPSA process. We have strengthened under IPSA fund projects in 38 countries, medical infrastructure across those small island countries. So I think the triangular cooperation or cooperation with partner countries under several UN platforms is becoming more and more important. So India's idea of self-reliance is not autarkic. It is to create local production so as to meet exigencies like this. And we had to start in several sectors from scratch, as I said, PPE kits, etc., ventilator. And this could happen. And I'm very glad that we are now exporting. Just yesterday, 2 flights left for Bhutan and Bangladesh with our vaccines. So these friendship flights are now bringing our neighbors under this health coverage that we are bringing into our own people through our own vaccines.
Thank you so much. Before I address a question to Mr. Devs, I would invite our audience. You can comment in the chat or Q&A pods, ask your questions. We open up the floor also in a couple of minutes, but if you have comments, questions, please put them in the chat, take them up in the discussion, or also if you would like to feel to comment on the statements made here. Mr. Devs, so the question goes also to you in this direction. So if one reads the internationalization strategy, the science diplomacy paper of Germany, there's a focus always on solving the societal and global challenges and the SDGs, you mentioned that, but how goes that together? And you mentioned it to attract more scientists to Germany and with our own national interests.
That's a good question. Perhaps I may as well add a bit to what Professor Chaturvedi just said. I think we in Germany have a slightly different perspective on that because we are at the heart of Europe and we are basically a trading nation that is gaining a lot of our wealth from exports, and we rely on free trade worldwide, including China. We have witnessed as well some issues at the beginning of the pandemic when we have had shortages that were overcome within a few months. But we saw that at least within Europe, we need common approaches. We saw that we are vulnerable as Europeans. That's why in our strategy, you will find the keywords of sovereignty and solidarity. So solidarity within Europe, which was not an easy issue at the beginning. Just look at the border closures. But what we as Europeans now have done is to create a common platform to distribute the vaccines, the different ones. And I think that's a great success for European integration, despite the a bit bumpy road in the beginning. But as an approach, I think it's absolutely essential that Europeans see the value of European integration. And coming back as well to the international cooperation, look at the BioNTech Pfizer vaccine. That's a wonderful example how this can bring results. You have a couple of researchers by Turkish descent, by the way, that had a relatively small company, then found a strong American partner, and now the vaccine is used in many countries worldwide. But coming to to an issue that is still looming, that is how we can make the slogan of a global public good reality. I'm very delighted to hear that India has made it possible to bring vaccines to neighboring countries. We as Europeans are not there yet. And that's simply because now our populations and politicians say the domestic needs are a priority, and this will probably last for a while. And this becomes more and more important, of course, as we have a better coverage of the vaccines. But this is a huge question that is a global North-South debate, and I have personally here in Foreign Office, we have of course a lot of sympathy of being as fast as possible to make that happen. Good. Now I talked along quite a bit and didn't answer your questions.
Yes. Yeah, in a certain direction. So yeah. Thanks for this insight, and also for tackling the European dimension, of course, as this is really important to Germany. Before I open the floor, I would maybe run a last round of questions related a bit to the India-German relations and the science diplomacy and science cooperation. And I would like to kick it off with Ms. Houston. So we've talking already about the necessity of evidence-based decision-making and policies and the support of science. So the Ministry of Education and Research is currently financing a monitoring project on the Asia-Pacific region, APRA monitoring it's called. Maybe in short, could you give us an insight in the monitoring, and there's quite a financial investment of the ministry, and why the ministry is running that APRA monitoring?
Yes, thank you very much for this question. Indeed, the cooperation with the whole region, Asian Pacific region, is very important for the Federal Ministry for Education and Research for years. And this monitoring is also a sign for the needs of strengthening cooperation in different fields. The idea behind is that the Federal Ministry for Education and Research would like to monitor different trends and potentials in different countries. And that is the reason why they started in 2017 a funding initiative dedicated on the Asian Pacific research area. The idea is to have long-standing information and monitoring, which are the main priorities in the countries from the region, the whole region, and where are trends for innovation and strategic developments, which could be also supported from the German side. There are two kinds of directions when we are talking about cooperation: the bilateral dimension and also the multilateral dimension. When we are talking about bilateral cooperation, the APRA monitoring should answer several questions. For example, where are important cooperations between Germany and countries from the region, and also where are potentials where Germany is not involved in. But also activities like how could innovation support actions in the field of innovations for more stability and prosperity in the region and in Germany. Regarding multilateral activities, APRA monitoring is aiming to compare the development in the target region with developments in the European research area, but also with the North American research area. And I think this information is very important when we are talking about evidence-based policy. This is a good example for that.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I just could encourage to have a look at it. It's really interesting data collecting for all the countries in the region, different aspects, innovation, technology, co-publications. So really, really interesting data, which is not so easy accessible and which is published there. So I think that's also for our attendees who were there from several international institutions that could be really, really useful to have a look to see and to use that for their own work. Mr. Delf, so the science diplomacy paper names India as one key region for the science cooperation in Germany, but we also have in place a new guideline for Asia Pacific after France, the second one in Europe. And an Indian think tank, the ORF, did a really interesting analysis of the paper, and they said that 66 times it's mentioned ASEAN and just 50 times India in the paper. So what is the role and the future of Indo-cooperation, and which will be the future fields of cooperation between India and Germany, and where Germany is seeing India?
Well, of course, this strategy, which was made possible by the whole German government, so all the different ministries just gave their input into the strategy, looks at very different aspects. And I think it's a kind of rediscovery of the whole region, which is huge. In fact, it stretches from New Zealand to the Pacific coast of the US, all the way up to Korea and to the Indic. And of course, India is, if you look at the different activities and the closeness of the relationship we have, and is very much at the heart. As Prime Minister Modi has said, it's a perfect partnership, two democracies based in multilateral structures that don't have any colonial burden. I think that's important as well, especially now as we look at Brexit and the relationship between the European continent and Great Britain. And we see that India clearly is a rising power. It has enormous potentials, and what Professor Chaturvedi just said about the speed, how fast a production can be placed into operation, is a good example how vibrant industry and science is there. I think we have already mentioned this long history, Max Müller and others who laid the foundation for that. But looking into the future, we see that with the young population, affinity to science and research, this exchange that we already have, and as well the industry that is looking at India as a place to look for talent, to produce and to do research in cooperation, no matter whether it is in Germany, in India, or this global community of researchers where basically the nationality is not that important. But as we have mentioned in our strategy, it's common knowledge production for the common good. I think that's something that we can't stress enough, especially in these times where the pandemic shows us how important it is. The one that really succeeded are the scientists. They worked probably the best under these circumstances, and their networks worked in a digitalized form, really worked all the time, and they made it possible that we had a number of vaccines within a year. That's wonderful. So coming back to India, we see a lot of potential, and I think on both sides there's a strong willingness to go beyond what we have at this stage. And mentioning our Chancellor Merkel, who won't be that long in office, she will quit this year, but of course she's a scientist as well. That's in many regards important, and I think that has shaped this relationship over the years, but we're confident that with the new government that will continue.
So is India the new China?
I can say frankly, I hope it won't be the new China in many aspects. But of course, everyone is looking at China, not only India. But there we see many developments that aren't so easy to handle. And despite the success in managing the crisis, there are aspects that both of our countries do not favor. And I think we have a different style of life, of politics, of different understanding of values. And this will be a continued discussion, and it will be a geopolitical power game. I think that is clear as well. We as Europeans have become more and more realistic over the years. We have our China strategy, and we are partners and competitors at the same time.
Okay, thanks for that, Mr. Chaturvedi. So you've been also to Germany, on a fellowship, and so it would be interesting. Where do you see the Indo-German cooperation heading? I mean, everybody knows that India did not adhere to the free trade contracts with the ASEAN region, and so where do you see the Indo-German cooperation heading, and maybe also in the broader context of the Indo-European relations, as we had the summit meet of the European Union with India. So would India look at Germany? Would India look at Europe? And what role does Europe and Germany play in the future scientific cooperation?
I think India-Germany cooperation, as Mr. Das very rightly mentioned, has been there for many centuries and has been strengthened over the years despite of the colonial past and since India got independence. So I think over the years it has strengthened. I myself have spent time with the German Development Institute, GDI in Bonn, and have very closely seen. In fact, I was sent to study the development cooperation model that Germany follows, and that was way back in 2007 when India was thinking of India's own aid agency, and I wrote the concept note for the government, and eventually India established what is called as Development Partnership Administration, DPA, which came into effect in 2011. And now India is giving $5.87 billion every year. So, and we have learned from Germany's multiple agencies and the way they coordinate across the spectrum. And this was one of the challenges because India's education department is also engaged outside, foreign affairs is also engaged outside, the health has its own program, agriculture ministry has its own program, Exim Bank has its own program. So multiple institutions all addressing India's development cooperation, and we had only country that we found pretty close to our own institutional architecture was Germany. And we also agreed with several principles and ideas and approaches that Germany has. So I see this going forward in a major way, be that in the realm of artificial intelligence, automobiles, and other frontier technologies, the blockchain, etc. We see this going forward. By the way, Dr. Katyash, we also have at RIS a very deep focus on India's traditional medicines and their global impact. So we are studying very closely Ayurveda and also homeopathy, which is very much part of now India's own adopted stream from Germany. And with Ayush, we have a major initiative of the government of India to see India's traditional medicine system, and homeopathy provides huge convergence of our understanding of how physiology really works. On the free trade part, the question that you raised, Dr. Dash, is more about insistence, because with ASEAN we have our free trade agreement, and it is continuing. It is continuing with Japan, with South Korea. We had problem with RCEP. and we have withdrawn from RCEP, and that is largely because of China. And we were not very comfortable with the trading deal that China was getting. Otherwise, we are very comfortable with ASEAN. We believe in centrality of ASEAN, and we are very much trade partners with ASEAN countries. What we see in future is the India-EU cooperation going forward, and there we see Germany as a pivot, and we realize the important role that Germany would play in the years to come to shape EU policies after Brexit has already happened. So we see India-Germany cooperation going forward in terms of the global approach on global public goods. As Mr. Darcy rightly said, we have to turn this slogan into reality, and that reality can happen once we adopt strategies that are going to take them forward. The role of Germany in Indo-Pacific that way would be extremely important. And I have been discussing with several academics from Germany as to how we go forward. German government runs a program called MGG, Managing Global Governance, which is funded by BMZ and has been inviting people from different countries. And I have myself been part of MGG, and we have contributed volumes and research articles in terms of how global aid architecture should look like. At UNDP and at other platforms, these discussions are very wide. And how South-South cooperation and OECD's DAC architecture, where Germany is playing an important role, can collectively contribute in terms of these programs, I think are going to go forward in a major way. So those are some of the issues which we are realizing in terms of how we are going to go forward in terms of creating capacities across countries. India-Germany partnership in third countries, be that in Africa or in other parts of Asia, is equally important. And that's why I say Germany and Japan are two countries in the world that have prevailed with the triangular cooperation. Their approaches of leveraging triangular cooperation strength and synergies are unique. And India and Germany can partner in Africa in a variety of ways, and Indian diaspora can really play an extremely important role on how we connect Asia and Africa, and the role that EU can play, led by Germany.
Thank you so much. You remarked that we changed the layout a bit because we want to open now the floor for discussion. So I would like, if there are questions, comments to the discussion, please raise your hand. I will take up the questions, and maybe you could then ask your questions with the mic, and if you feel comfortable with the camera. So let us see if there are questions coming in to our panel discussion. It does not seem to be the case, but then maybe I see that Dr. Reddy Nandineni from the Indian Embassy in Germany is connected to us. Mr. Reddy, maybe you could contribute a little bit on the activities, in the German activities, and what is the take at the moment, and what is the action taking place on site, if you would like. Okay, this does not seem to work. Okay, then I ask another question to the panel, and we see if there are questions coming in. So we've discussed a lot about science diplomacy, stakeholders. So I would like to ask the question, and maybe we kick it off with Ms. Josten. Who is the better science diplomat, a scientist or a diplomat? So
Thank you very much for this challenging question. It's quite interesting to go into this topic, because there is no definition for science diplomacy, and I would like to start with this term. There are, of course, scientists dealing with diplomatic measures and also diplomats dealing with scientific measures. And this is also a very challenging process. I think when we are talking about, I would say, science diplomats, we have to think in two directions: knowledge and skills. Knowledge is, for scientists, for example, knowledge is important because scientists should learn how to interpret policy measures, how to better understand strategies, and prepare themselves for strategic negotiations, for example. Policymakers should better understand the outcome of scientific research and to summarize this content on a better way and to use it for political measures. So this is the knowledge dimension, and I think there is another dimension: skills, skills on negotiations, which are especially for scientists very much needed. Skills on storytelling, for example, how to communicate different outputs. It's related to policymakers but also to scientists, and we have to talk about languages, and I think language not only as a language but also as intercultural communication is important when we are talking about science diplomats. So to answer your question, I think there is no scientists or diplomats who are the best science diplomats, actually. But I think there are a lot of skills and knowledge which should be used when dealing with science diplomacy. So I think this is all I could say at that stage. I hope this is okay for you.
Yes, thank you. I see that Dr. Reddy Nandineni is now with us, and as he is a science diplomat at the embassy in Berlin, so he is the Science Council, Indian Science Council in Germany. Maybe you can take up that question: who is the better science diplomat, the scientist, or is the diplomat the better science diplomat? So who should work in science diplomacy?
Professor Chaturvedi and Mr. Dwells, good afternoon and good morning. I was listening to the conversation, and just now the audio and video link was allowed, so therefore it was very nice. Thank you for inviting me to this forum. And I was listening with interest all the talk Professor Chaturvedi and Mr. Dwells and Ms. Justin was giving for the past few minutes. As regards your question whether it's a scientist or a diplomat, I would say a scientific diplomat is needed for our work. Basically, if you look at this, as you have said, science for diplomacy and diplomacy for science, you need a scientist who can actually bridge the bridges for that diplomacy. And there are many instances in the history and in the recent past where scientists have actually built what is called as track 2 or track 3 diplomacy, wherein even if the nations are having some issues or hostilities, the scientists actually, because of their nature, they are connecting with across nationalities, across the nations, and they were actually the bridges, and sometimes very effective bridges in bringing cooperation between countries, even though at the political level they had issues of directly talking to each other. Scientists, artists, culture, they actually play an important role. And in all these spheres, especially we have seen how during Cold War, how during Cuban crisis, or even during other aspects like Iranian nuclear agreement also. The energy secretary and the Iranian appointment for the agreement were actually colleagues at some time at MIT in US. So that helped. So usually the scientists have a more role to play, and that's it.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Thank you, Dr. Reddy. Good to see you, and greetings to Berlin. We have a question here from Tanja Friedrich, who is working within or heading the science section in the EU delegation, and I think that goes to Mr. Chaturvedi. How to balance the indigenous focus and meeting global challenges?
The question
how to balance the focus on indigenization, so self-reliance, and meet the global challenges. So how this goes together and how one could balance.
That's a very delicate balance, and there's a very thin line, I would say, between the inward-looking policies and the outgoing and outward-oriented economic policies. As Prime Minister has time and again clarified, the idea is to encourage interdependence. And as you might have seen, the policy document STIP 2020, it very categorically on page 47 mentions the idea of global engagement. It says that we have to bring in the heft that is needed in terms of global role. But local production to meet our requirements, that's essential, be that in terms of food security or health security. So those are the minimum that is required. But for many other dimensions, interdependence is important. In fact, if you look at India's trade statistics, 38% of India's imports go for our exports. So this interdependence is huge. Our trade in parts and components is growing, and India's integration in global value chains is important. And this is where I think in years to come, we have to work in a very constructive manner so that the foreign firms find it easier to invest and produce, and also the unfinished go to other sectors for further processing. So she's absolutely right that we need to bring in this delicate balance. Again, the federal budget would be presented on the first day of the next month, and we are expecting that the government would soon come back to the idea of low tariff structures and facilitating the larger access to exporters from other countries to Indian market.
Okay, thank you so much. Here we have another question. How can scientists train themselves to be involved in science diplomacy? I would pose that to Ms. Joosten, as she has been an interesting project on science diplomacy where an online course is offered.
Yes, thank you very much for this question. Indeed, there is a huge need for training activities, and our S4D4C project is dedicated on science diplomacy. One main task of this project are training activities for diplomats or for scientists. And what we have learned is that there is a need for interaction. So the best way how to learn about science diplomacy is to have an interaction amongst scientists and diplomats, put them in one room and let them exchange different ideas and also skills, learn from each other. As you already mentioned, we have an online course for free. So it is on our website. We have received more than 6,000 registration, and from India we have also many participants from India interested in science diplomacy, which is a very good sign for the future cooperation in this field. And I think besides of online activities, there is a need of personal interaction, building community among scientists, among diplomats, via Twitter, LinkedIn, or webinars, or such kind of conferences like today. I think for scientists, it is important to interact and to communicate, to be open for new formats, and to take part probably in such kind of training activities offered by different organizations.
Maybe Mr. Chaturvedi, 2 words on the Indian Forum for Science Diplomacy and on the trainings you are offering, as far as I'm aware.
Absolutely right, Dr. Lesh, because the FISD Forum for Indian Science Diplomacy, which we are running at RIS, is supported and funded by the Ministry of Science and Technology, and what we are trying to do is to support some 7 big initiatives under this program. One is to invite scholars from various countries who are interested in learning about science diplomacy concepts, and there we have our unique perspective, and I would very much like to invite you to see the website of FISD and see the papers. So we, in a way, AAAS narrative on science diplomacy is good for advanced economies of OECD, but for developing countries like India and in Africa, science diplomacy is more about the localization of development. It is more about building domestic capacities to cope up and have so we have been inviting around 30 participants from various African countries to RIS. They spend some 3 weeks. The air travel, the stay, and the study material all are free of cost for them, and we expose them to India's scientific facilities and also give them the conceptual frameworks which we feel are strong on conceptual basis of this idea of Indianization and endogeneity in the growth process. So we believe that those structural changes are important. We have launched our own journal, what we call a Science Diplomacy Review, to bring in the developing country perspective on science diplomacy and encourage countries to have their own narratives on development and the role that science technology should play. We also have developed certain capsules for developing countries to use so as to integrate convergence of science technology in their economic policies and in their climate change related policies. So how India is trying to combine the role of the International Solar Alliance or even disaster management, how the disaster resilient infrastructure, because quite a few developing countries are building infrastructure. India is also in that. So how that can be done, what role technology can play. And one of the most important role, Dr. Lash, is about financial inclusion. Most of the developing countries have citizens who do not have bank account, who do not have access to brick and mortar bank branches. So they require technology to access what is called as digital payment architecture. And this India has uniquely contributed. In last 6 years, India has opened more than 365 million bank accounts. 365 million bank accounts have been opened in last 5 years. So this could happen because of technology. And this we are sharing with several countries, ideas, experiences. And in fact, RIS has now established a global development center to share some of these flagship programs with fellow developing countries. So science, technology, innovation is playing an important role in economic development and leveraging that as part of the development strategy to engage in diplomacy, which brings in development at the center and science for innovation embedded within that concept. So your question whether a diplomat is a good person or scientist is a good person, I think a team is a better sort of setting to play. Both have to reinforce each other and take this forward. And of course, role of education comes in there.
And I think that the approach to switch in between the two fields, like Dr. Reddy, who is a scientist and then goes to science diplomacy coming back, or myself going into international cooperation management. So I think there should be a certain flexibility. There is a question on science, citizen science, the involvement of civil society in science diplomacy. So what is the envisioned role, Mr. Des, and how important it is? So civil society and science diplomacy.
Well, I think that's crucial. There's this word that you can't leave the science to the scientists, that citizens should get involved. And of course, that has a long history as well. As you all know, the counting of birds by people in various parts of the country that dates already for over a century. But what we aim now, and I think that does our Ministry for research and education as well, is to mobilize citizens not only on single projects, but to take part in the debate, to bring in their interest as well as NGOs or as groups. They don't have all to be organized, and to shape where we want to go. And taking part in studies, collecting data, bringing in insights is one aspect, but the other one is to communicate on what the research is about and to make it part of a common debate. And this doesn't have to be limited to its own countries. You could imagine to have citizen science to internationalize as well. And I think now, as we all sit at home, that's the best opportunity to start with that, to connect with others and to see what can be done together to the common good to reach the SDGs.
Yeah, thank you so much for that insight. I think we have a very interesting question on the role of social sciences and humanities. So we have talking a lot about technology development. We are talking about science and technology. Now there is the science and technology policy in place. So what is the role for science diplomacy when it comes to supporting science disciplines that are difficult to communicate and where maybe the benefit is not seen immediately? Mr. Chaturvedi.
Thank you. Thanks, Dr. Katalesh. I think there are a couple of programs which have very clearly identified role of humanities in understanding science policy. And fortunately, I was part of FP7 programs, and particularly with a couple of institutions in Germany and Netherlands, where we could see what role responsible research and innovation RRI can play. And the role that RRI plays is important in terms of understanding how we bring in responsible research and innovation at the center. And in context of India, we saw it more from the point of view of access, equity, and inclusion. So if social objectives are embedded with the economic priorities of the government, then social scientists and humanities have to play an important role. In India, the principal scientific advisor, Dr. P.S. Raghavan, is playing a very important role in combining and in converging natural sciences with humanities. If you pick up STIP 2020, the new science technology policy document, it's absolutely clear that the government's intention is to encourage this convergence. And this convergence is going to play an extremely important role on how science society connect comes in. In fact, in the 2016 Indian National Science Congress address, Prime Minister Modi clearly identified the social responsibility of scientists. And that is nothing but a more indigenized concept of how responsible the scientific community would be, not only for their resources, but also in terms of prioritizing issues where domestic challenges are huge. So what Mr. Jalf said, that it cannot be left alone to scientists, I think is absolutely right. But then also you need to connect with the economic and social priorities of the country, depending on what stage of development they are in. And I think that's where the role of humanities comes in with natural sciences.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I would maybe address to our two panelists the last question, and I think that's a bit of a more general, coming back to the concept of science diplomacy and soft power, no? So how large is the science diplomacy or the influence on science diplomacy on international relations and national relations? So when it comes also to difficult partners, no? We mentioned China and Russia, for instance. So what is the role of science diplomacy in maybe to overcome also differences, and how large is the influence of science diplomacy in these relations? And I would, ladies first, start with Ms. Jost.
The role of science diplomacy, Yes, it's crucial to have communication ways, and I think this is the main role which science diplomacy could have in the communication with political challenging countries, as you already named. I think what is needed in science diplomacy is to have this bridge, and which also has been mentioned previously, to have a kind of communication, and science could be a good way to build this bridge. I was involved in several activities previously related to cooperation with Russia, and also in the preparation of the German-Russian roadmap. And science in the scientific community was the base for the preparation of the further activities. It was a bottom-up approach, and scientists were actively involved, and they have actively recommended several actions how to strengthen the cooperation between these countries. And I think this is a very important role of the science, which should be used in the future more intensively. And what is also important, probably as a last sentence, is to have a common coordinated version. It is important to have a version in the European Union between countries, but also at the national level. Coordinated approaches are very crucial in that field. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Chaturvedi?
I think there are three broad features of science diplomacy that can bring in the heft to soft power. I'm generally wary of using the word soft power because it has the power content in it. For developing countries, it is more a partnership rather than the power equation, which most of the US scholars very much believe in. It has hard power and soft power. So out of that binary, if we think of engagement, I would say that apart from fellowships that are provided under this to do the capacity building, and I mentioned in the beginning that there are more than 100,000 fellowships that are being given by India every year for science, technology, innovation, promotion. There are several joint studies that are initiated, and that I think if you look at the joint forest management between India, Myanmar, and India, Bangladesh, Bhutan, you see an effort in terms of in situ and ex situ conservations that are there, joint drug development, say, between South Africa and India, joint studies between Brazil and India. So you find more and more efforts for joint strategizing for R&D and creating the collective advantages. That is one. And as I mentioned in the beginning, that India is supplying vaccines. So just day before yesterday, some 150,000 doses were sent to Bhutan. Yesterday, around 100,000 doses have been sent to Maldives. Bangladesh and Nepal are also likely to get these doses. And this is when India's own vaccination has not been completed. But there is no adverse commentary in India's media or any way that when our needs are not met, why you are exporting it. Because that's the philosophy with which the whole idea of global engagement is being addressed. And that's where the central concept of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, or as we say, a world as a family, is being propounded by Prime Minister time and again, so that people start sharing advancements of technology. And India is not at the cutting edge. There are many other countries that have already achieved that, and private sector is minting, and we are giving this without any charges or very limited payments to be made by the partner countries, even free of cost, like for Nepal. So the important thing is how you are positioning yourself in terms of sharing the scientific and technological advancements, in what way you are proposing yourself to address and bring that forward. So some of these dimensions augment the soft power, generate trust, and generate the dimensions that are important. And all this, I think, largely Dr. Katalesh contributes to the narrative building that I was saying. So for instance, if International Biosafety Protocol or International Protocol for Access and Benefit Sharing, ABS, if those have to come in, you have a constituency that appreciates the idea of global negotiations in those areas where you need, or even for STI, for SDG, you require the global sort of facilities to come up, like for instance, Technology Facilitation Mechanism, TFM. So if TFM has to be operationalized, if TFM has to be taken forward, countries have to be with you to understand and appreciate. And if they have gone through these challenges and post-pandemic, the world would be open for more of such challenges as we saw. It's not the irresponsibility of one country, but it is vulnerability of millions of people. So how we collectively bring in a narrative for whether biological warfare, terrorism management, etc. We need to collate scientific evidence together. We need to bring the biological sort of strengths to deal with national security issues and bring that strategic dimension up there, I think would be extremely important. So global narrative building would be important. If tomorrow what President Trump did with Venezuela or Russia or with Turkey to suspend SWIFT, if it is suspended tomorrow, what alternative we have to SWIFT? So technology and technology's access to finance is very crucial, and we need to build that, and that would augment the soft power that we are talking about, and that would add to global conventions that would come in, and that's what I meant when I was saying that global public goods have been sort of required, and Germany has played an extremely important role. Inga Kohl and others have contributed to the narrative on global public goods. Global public goods are not in one sector, but in several sectors. So we need to see how India and Germany can collectively work, how South-South cooperation and how North-South cooperation and how triangular cooperation can actually strengthen and contribute to the global public goods, particularly in the realm of science technology for management of global security would be very important.
Thank you so much. So, Mr. Delf, this question also goes to you.
Yeah, thanks for widening the debate to the development sphere. I think that's extremely important for many countries. I wanted to start with the funding of research and technology. We have seen that even within the Trump administration, that the budget for scientific purposes has not suffered. Congress basically upheld the level of it, and that's very comforting. And we look with even more optimism now to the next presidency and its administration, and there we can see soft power. Generations of scientists have enjoyed a very good education at American universities. And I think this, to a large extent, is still shaping parts of the scientific world. If you look at the Nobel Prize winners and all the indicators or the university indexes and so on. So I would argue it is still an important aspect of diplomacy, how you can present your country, what kind of influences of attractiveness it has as well in global negotiations, and therefore I'm very optimistic that the rise of the budgets for scientific purposes in many countries, including Germany and the European Union, we just have now decided on our budget frame for the next 7 years, and Horizon 20 and other programs really got more money than in the last round. And so I would argue this is the most important basis for all we as government, as diplomats, can have. But the other aspect is, of course, to really bring these billions of dollars and euros and other currencies into the right direction, and that is meaning that we as a mankind have a good chance to survive over not only 50 years, but many, many more years to come, and to have a world in freedom, in democracy, and in security.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much for the interesting discussion, for the interesting questions. I think we tackled a lot of problems going from small to large to mankind and surviving of the mankind at the end. So thank you again, Mr. Delfs, Mr. Chaturvedi, Ms. Josten, and thank you to the audience for the questions. I would like to mention that this is for the German Center for Research and Innovation as a beginning, so we will take further action on the topics and discuss today. And to foster, of course, Indo-German cooperation. We have an exciting year ahead of us with interesting events. We learned today that science communication and citizen science is a part of science diplomacy. We will tackle, for instance, this question at the Indo-German Forum, 16th, 17th of March, where we talk about citizen climate, but also about citizen involvement and science communication. If you want to have a closer look at the papers and initiatives discussed, please visit our site dedicated to the event. We will also, latest Monday, be able to provide a recording of the session, so for those who could not make it today. And I would also like to announce that we are currently working on a web application which will do exactly that thing, connecting scientists, bringing scientists together. It will be an application showcasing the existing projects, Indo-German research projects, which will offer the possibility to connect researchers, and which will also give for the first time an overview on the funding opportunities available, as well as India as Germany in one place. So to have a new platform of information, we will put that online also in March. So thanks again to everybody for the fruitful discussion. Greetings to Berlin, Bonn, and Delhi. I hope we stay in contact also with the participants. I've seen a lot of names we know. So if you want to discuss with us further, feel free to connect to us. Thank you again, and have a nice noon or a nice afternoon. Thanks again, and I say bye-bye.